Good morning. The Ford Mondeo Mk5, sometimes referred to as Mondeo IV, Mk1, and Mk2, are sometimes counted as one generation, hence the discrepancy, is a car decently protected against corrosion in visible places. The exception here are the light alloy rims, which in some copies after years do not look too good. Read about invisible places in the next section. On the electrical side, sources usually mention the not-so-durable LED headlights when it comes to faults, but I have to admit that I have never seen any that were faulty, and there are plenty of these cars on the road. In addition, according to users, the standard halogen lights are so mediocre in efficiency that if someone does not drive exclusively during the day, it is worth considering LEDs. Note: early models had problems with the lights suddenly turning off. There was a service campaign. In addition, automatic air conditioning may also be faulty. There was a service campaign. It is essential to check whether the car is subject to a service campaign related to faulty Takata airbags. They can be dangerous to health and life in the event of an accident. There are problems with the keyless system, but the most common inconvenience is probably peeling paint from the steering wheel. This is typical for Fords of this period. You can try to repaint it or simply reupholster it, which may be worth considering, as the standard steering wheel is relatively thin, which not everyone likes. In addition, the plastics in the interior scratch quite easily. Those looking for a better finish can opt for the top-of-the-range Vignale variant, which had, among other things, a leather-trimmed dashboard. Typically for this brand, screw connections, e.g. on suspension elements, usually look much worse in terms of corrosion, but this is usually not a major problem, although it cannot be ruled out that in extreme cases, the seized screws will have to be cut out. The suspension is relatively durable, but some users have only moderately positive opinions about the longevity of the brakes and tires, which is not surprising, considering the fact that the Mondeo Mk5 has gained weight compared with the Mk4. The following petrol engines were offered in this generation Mondeo: 1.0 EcoBoost, 125 HP, emission standard Euro 6. 1.5 EcoBoost, up to 5 2018's 160 HP and Euro 6 emission standard, later 165 HP and Euro 6 DTEMP. 2.0 EcoBoost, 203 or 240 HP, both Euro 6 versions. 2.0 Hybrid, system power 187 HP, initially Euro 6, from 2 2019's Euro 6 D-Temp, from 9 2020's Euro 6D. The smallest engine is a rarity. It was offered for 3 years, 2015 to 2018, but not on all markets, and even where it was offered, its popularity was very low. This is perfectly illustrated by the number of such cars on Otomoto. At the time of writing, there was one whole copy there. For comparison, there were over 171.5 Petrols. On mobile.de, it is not much better. The 1.0 group was represented by 5 copies, including 3 estate cars, out of 366, 1.5 copies. Generally, all EcoBoosts seem to be better than they are known to be, which is not to say that they do not have typical faults. Well, they do, some quite serious ones too. 1.0 EcoBoost has a timing belt that works in oil. There are problems with this solution, although not as severe as in 1.2 PureTech from Stellantis. Nevertheless, the belt should be replaced no less frequently than every 120,000 kilometers. The manufacturer initially recommended 240,000 kilometers. And the cleanliness of the oil strainer should be checked. In addition, you have to reckon with the accumulation of carbon on the valves, which can lead to a loss of power and damage to the valves themselves and their seats, as well as a drop in fuel pressure, the pump's fault, and wear of the valve glasses. It should be noted that 1.0 EcoBoost engines caused the most problems until 2014 and at that time they were not yet in the Mondeo range. Damage to the head gasket, the head itself, or problems with the cooling system happen much less frequently, although it is a good idea to check the coolant level. The 1.5 EcoBoost unit is in practice a modernized and slightly reduced version of the older 1.6 EcoBoost engine used in the Mondeo Mk4, for example. The reduction in capacity was achieved by shortening the piston stroke. The cylinder diameter is the same. Important information is that, contrary to what some sources write, in this engine the timing belt does not work in an oil bath. It is a regular, dry belt, exactly the same as in the 1.6 exabytes. The 1.5 exabytes is considered a better engine than the older 1.6, with particular emphasis on improving the quality of the cooling system. Potential failures usually include the sensitivity of the injection system to fuel quality and its faults in general, of the injection system, not the fuel. And also, just like in 1.6, the engine sensitivity to the occurrence of the LSPI phenomenon resulting in the so-called supernock combustion, which can destroy the engine. The risk can be limited, among other things, by using the right engine oil, e.g. a PISN Plus quality class or higher. This is much more important for these engines than meeting the Ford standard. However, if someone really cares about this Ford standard, there are individual oils on the market that meet both the Ford standard and the appropriate API, ACA, or ILSAC standards. Despite everything, I would also recommend paying attention to the condition of the cooling system. Ford has had problems with this for years, and in exactly such an engine, I recently had to deal with a water pump failure after driving approx. 60,000 kilometers from new. This is of course anecdotal evidence, although worrying. Another problem is carbon deposits. After the facelift, 1.5 engines gained a particulate filter. We don't hear much about the problems associated with it, but if someone mainly drives in the city, this information may be of interest to them. You also have to be careful with LSPI in the 2.0 exabytes. There are cases of cracked pistons, and apparently this may be related to supernocking combustion. Of course, carbon deposits also occur here, which is the result of using only direct fuel injection. In addition, we have potential problems with the fuel system or damage to the exhaust manifolds and turbochargers. And it really doesn't matter which of these elements breaks, because in this case the manifold is integrated with the turbocharger. The last proposal in the category of engines powered by unleaded is a naturally aspirated 2.0 unit installed in the Ford Mondeo hybrid. This unit is interesting in that it has indirect fuel injection, which is why some people are eager to install gas installations here. The only difference is that this engine is based on the older Duritex, which in turn are slightly modified Mazda L-series engines, which are not particularly fond of LPG. You have to bear in mind the potentially limited durability. The following diesel engines were used in this generation of Ford Mondeo. 1.6 Duratorque TDCi, 115 HP, Euro 6 standard. 1.5 Duratorque TDCi, 120 HP, Euro 6, replaced the 1.6 TDCi in 2015. 2.0 Duratorque TDCi, 150, 180 or 209 horsepower, the latter of which has two turbochargers, Euro 6. 2.0 EcoBlue, 120, 150 or 190 horsepower, Euro 6 D-Temp standard, in 2019 replacing the 1.5 and 2.0 TDCi. The 1.6 and 2.0 TDCi units are well-known engines designed together with PSA. Every mechanic knows them, and they do not stand out negatively in terms of durability compared to the competition. The faults do not go beyond the turbodiesel standard, dual mass, injection system, or turbocharger wear. 1.5 TDCi is a slightly reduced and modernized version of 1.6. There is no need to be afraid of it, because it does not generate additional problems compared to the older engine. However, it must be remembered that while 1.6 TDCi engines were structurally identical to 1.6 HDI used in Peugeot or Citroëns, in the case of 1.5 engines, the situation is completely different. TDCi basically has no common parts with HDI, including the timing drive. In Ford, the timing is 8-valve, and in the French, 16-valve, because the issue of reducing the displacement was solved in a different way. The cylinder diameter was reduced, while Peugeot and Citroën reduced the piston stroke. The last option is the 2.0 EcoBlue units. In them, you have to watch out for the timing belt operating in an oil bath, and absolutely do not listen to the manufacturer who wants to replace the belt every 240,000 kilometers. Shortening the interval by half is the minimum. Some authorized service centers recommend replacing the belt every 90,000 kilometers. The following gearboxes were used in the Mondeo Mk5. 6-speed manual, standard on 1.0 and 1.5 EcoBoost, and 1.5, 1.6 and 2.0 TDCi, as well as 2.0 EcoBlue, 120 and 150 HP. 6-speed automatic, torque converter, standard on 2.0 EcoBoost, optional on 1.5 EcoBoost. 8-speed automatic, Torque converter, standard on 2.0 EcoBlue 190 HP, optional on 2.0 EcoBlue 150 HP. 6-speed double clutch, standard on 2.0 TDCi biturbo 209 HP, optional on other 2.0 TDCi. Planetary ECVT, in Mondeo hybrid. The MMT6 manual gearbox is not considered as successful as the 5-speed gearboxes MTX75 in older Fords, but in most cases when problems occur, it is due to wear or incorrect oil selection. Ford, back in the days of the Mondeo Mk4 and other parallel models using MMT6, had a problem with developing the right oil for several years, which resulted, and can still result, if you buy the wrong one, problems with selecting gears or simply deterioration of the gearbox. Even if it does not happen immediately after the oil change, there is a risk that it will happen within a few weeks. Usually in texts of this Type 1, do not recommend specific products, but considering my riser is on this topic, I think no one will hold it against me if I point out that I am talking about Ford 75WFE oils, not 75W90, and Castrol Transmax Manual FE75W. Additionally, in cars with 1.0 and 1.5 exabytes engines from 2016 to 2018, you need to check whether they are not subject to a service campaign for faulty clutch pressure plates. 6-speed automatics don't cause any major problems, but the same can't be said about newer 8-speed gearboxes. Sometimes even cars with low mileage end up in service due to gearbox failures, and what's worse, they're not always, or maybe, not everyone, able to repair them. 6-speed gearboxes, on the other hand, have much worse opinions when it comes to operation. They are rated as slow and taking away from the driving pleasure, and this type is. Double clutch gearboxes were used only in turbo diesels, which is not very good news, because power shifts in other Ford models work much better when combined with petrol engines. Breakdowns are much rarer then. They last the shortest during dynamic driving or in difficult conditions, e.g. when towing heavy trailers, etc. An interesting feature of power-shift gearboxes combined with 2.0 TDCi engines is their rather lazy nature for this type of transmission. I had the opportunity to drive a Mondeo 2.0 TDCi bi-turbo with power shift, and from its behavior, I would not have guessed that it was not a hydrokinetic, and one focused on driving comfort. The last option is the ECVT planetary gearbox, used in hybrid Mondeos. Surprisingly and unfortunately, this is not the strongest point of the Ford drive system. It does not match the durability of the Toyota solution, although the idea is the same. It is absolutely necessary to remember to change the oil regularly, as in other gearboxes. Without it, the risk of failure will increase. There are also repeated opinions about the slow operation of the ECVT and the impression of taking power. But in the case of continuously variable transmissions, it is difficult to avoid such an impression if the car has less than 250 or 300 HP, and the Mondeo Hybrid has 187. It should be added here that for the first time since the Mondeo Mk1, this Ford model could be ordered with all-wheel drive, with switchable rear. AWD was available only in the 2.0 TDCi diesels, 150 and 180 HP, and 2.0 EcoBlue, 190 HP. But note, in the 150 HP TDCi AWD was combined only with a 6-speed manual, in the 180 HP, only with power shift, and in the EcoBlue, only with an 8-speed automatic. As you can easily guess, the potentially least risky option is the 2.0 TDCi 150 HP. The all-wheel drive in the Mondeo may not be a model for others in terms of operation, but it usually does not cause problems. I came across a statement by one of the leading Ford tuners in Poland, and not only, who called the cases of AWD failures marginal. There is, however, some risk of failure, and it usually results from too little oil in the rear axle or damage after towing the Mondeo Mk5 on the so-called butterfly. The front axle is raised, the rear wheels are spinning. The symptoms are usually such that when turning, the car gives the impression that the rear differential is engaged, grinding, rattling, wheel skipping. The Haldex is not dismantled here, but it can be replaced, or the entire axle can be replaced. It can be one from the Kuga. You can perform basic diagnostics yourself to check if it is actually the AWD that is causing the problems. You can disconnect the plug at the Haldex. The car will then throw up errors about a drive system failure or overheating, but but if it starts driving fine with only the front wheels driven, it is a sign that you need to look into repairing the drive system. If I were to point out what to avoid, it would be primarily neglected models. This may be a popular car, but it is also modern, which can drive up repair costs, as well as cars with dual-clutch transmissions and 8-speed automatics. The rest of the potential problems do not stand out from other cars in this segment, assuming that the user takes care of the car in a basic scope. I would also suggest caution when looking at cars with coolant levels below the maximum, although in 2 different Ford-authorized service centers, when changing the coolant, they only filled it to the minimum, so such a level of coolant may or may not be due to faults. It is worth remembering this. And if you know of any common errors, your comments are welcome.